Welcome back, everyone. I'm excited to move forward with our second installment of the MBOLD Interview Series. As mentioned yesterday, MBOLD is a coalition of the leading food and ag companies in Minnesota who are working together to accelerate solutions to the most pressing challenges facing the food and agriculture sectors today, particularly around climate change and the growing demand for food. I am honored to have Steve Rosenzweig join us. Steve is a soil scientist at General Mills, where he leads regenerative agriculture research and outreach programs. He works to accelerate farmer adoption of regenerative ag and measure the impacts on soil, water, biodiversity, climate, and farm economics in key ingredient sourcing regions. I'm looking forward to learning more about the impressive work General Mills is doing in this regenerative ag space. And I'll remind all of you at home to please submit questions in the Q&A chat, as you don't want to miss your chance to learn more from this expert. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks for the invite to give this presentation. Today I'm going to talk about really how General Mills' perspective has evolved over the last few years to see the problems and solutions in the food and ag sector in a different way, and how that's transformed our strategies and investments in agricultural sustainability. I'm not saying that everyone should do exactly what General Mills is doing, and I'm definitely not saying that we have it all figured out, but I do want to highlight this paradigm shift that's happening in the industry and its powerful implications for both our company and the food and ag sector more broadly. So here's a little outline of what I'll talk about today. So I'll talk about tell the story of General Mills' journey from sustainability to regeneration. I'll dig into what regenerative ag is and how we define it. I'll talk about some of the strategies that we're piloting for accelerating adoption of regenerative ag in our key sourcing regions, and also how we're measuring the economic and environmental impact of that adoption. And I'll talk about why that is such an important part, and mostly what I work on as well. So, but first, I just want to give a couple recent headlines. We're not the only ones in the industry that I think are making this type of shift. These are just a few recent headlines with some commitments or investments that have been made in regard to regenerative ag. And this concept of regeneration more broadly even. And I'm going to talk about this shift within General Mills but one thing to note is that our perspective is different from these other companies working in this space. We're not all talking about it exactly the same way, but hopefully this will shed some light on a little bit about what's happening in the industry. Here are our sustainability commitments and pillars over the last 10 years. And I'm showing this to you to show you how we've traditionally talked about sustainability. And so we've got a sustainable sourcing commitment you can see is wrapping up here in 2020. And that's focused on seeing continuous improvement in industry aligned efficiency metrics, things like yield per unit land, per unit water or nutrients, basically focused on producing as much food as possible with as little negative impact to other natural resources. We've also got a water commitment that's focused on addressing water risks, and a climate commitment, a science-based target to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint across our full value chain. And I'll show you what that greenhouse gas commitment looks like. So in 2014, 2015, we had a third-party audit of our greenhouse gas emissions from farm to fork to landfill and found that agriculture is over half of our footprint, almost 60%. And that's really when we decided, when we realized that we need to focus most of our effort in agriculture. Most of our environmental impact occurs outside of General Mills' four walls. And so we really need to build these muscles to engage, upstream in the agricultural sector to improve the environmental impact and meet our greenhouse gas reduction goal. Really, as we look across all of our sustainability goals, we've made progress across all of these things, but it's not enough just for us to meet our goals. We need the whole industry to achieve sustainability targets if we're going to have a habitable planet and a resilient food system. And so as we look across the industry and ask, is the food and ag sector sustainable? Here are a few trends that we see. The first is that all of our food comes from just a few feet of topsoil, and basically we're degrading this soil at unsustainable rates. This photo is from a rest stop in Iowa, showing how much topsoil has been lost in that area. We can only grow food in this top part here. But globally, about a third of the world's soil is degraded today, and that's projected to increase to 90% over the next 30 years. So we have to reverse these trends if we want to have a stable and resilient food system. Next is we're losing biodiversity at unsustainable rates, faster than almost any other point in Earth's history. And agriculture is the biggest driver of this biodiversity loss. And this is bad for a lot of reasons, but one is that it hurts farmers. Biodiversity performs functions that are critical for food production, like pollination, predation of pests, weed seed granivory, residue decomposition. All of these really important things happen because of biodiversity. And that's part of what we lose when we lose biodiversity. Also agriculture remains a major threat to water, and that's we're using water faster than it can be replenished for critical water sources like the Ogallala Aquifer, and climate change is going to further widen the gap between demand and supply. Also, water quality trends in the U.S. at least are mixed. So some regions are getting better, some are getting worse. But the Gulf of Mexico, which you can see here, which drains most of the farmland in the U.S., water quality there is not improving. There's still a lot of work to do on the waterfront. One thing that we don't talk about enough in the sustainability space is farm businesses. As a food company, we depend on profitable, resilient farming communities. But farmers are under mounting economic pressure. This is a graph of the Canadian farm economy. And what we see is that, gross farm revenue, the total money coming into agriculture, is going up. Farmers are producing more food than ever before. But really this green line going down or flat is realized net farm income, which is the total amount of money that farmers actually get to keep at the end of the day. And this is actually with government subsidies subtracted, which gives a more realistic picture of what's going on. And so you can see that really what's eating up this profit is farm expenses. It's getting more expensive to sustain these higher and higher yields. And so, one of the key things that we can do is help farmers, increase or maintain productivity while reducing reliance on these external inputs. And that can be a path towards greater profitability. And, the last thing that I'll talk about is that we continue to see the climate impact of agriculture continue to increase. And so this is a graph of the global greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture over time. You can see it's increasing and it will continue to increase if we don't change anything. The dotted line going down is where we need to get agricultural emissions in order to have a shot against climate change. So that's an 80% reduction in the next 30 years. And climate change is already severely affecting agricultural production through more extreme weather. So we have to both mitigate and adapt to climate change, which is going to be a big challenge that's going to require a transformative solution. So, as we look across these trends, we have to ask, where is the industry now? These all are trends that cannot continue forever without a collapse of the system. So by definition, we are unsustainable, somewhere on this degenerative side of the spectrum. And with the magnitude and the urgency of these issues, it's not enough necessarily to shoot for being marginally more efficient. In a lot of cases in agricultural sustainability, we're shooting for reducing harm, trying to bring working in silos across different issue areas. Like water, folks will work on a water project. Biodiversity folks will work on a pollinator project over here. Everybody kind of independently trying to bring their problem area closer to sustainable. And this is true even at General Mills. We think back to some of our sustainability commitments, they've been somewhat siloed in the past. But these issues, soil, water, biodiversity, climate, farm economics, they're not happening independently. They're all connected. And this has been a big revelation for us, that these issues are all created or exacerbated by the same thing, and that is a dysfunctional agricultural ecosystem. So what do I mean by that? On the left is a soil with a poor soil structure. So it's unable to infiltrate the water from this rainstorm. So all of that water so what you're seeing there is flooding on that field on the left. So that water is going to be running off into streams and rivers, degrading waterways, further degrading the soil, and not adding to the bank of soil moisture that's needed to grow crops. On the right, this field has a functional water cycle. So that soil can use all of that water to grow crops, and which builds the farmer's economic resilience and also keeps the surface and groundwaters clean. And this is a picture of the water cycle, but we also have the power to repair and enhance the nutrient cycle, the pest and disease cycle, the carbon cycle. These are ecosystem processes that influence yields and yield stability from year to year, the amount of inputs a farmer needs to buy and water they need to use, the carbon sequestration and the greenhouse gas footprint of the farm, and even biodiversity from insects to birds. So as we've progressed on our journey from sustainability to regeneration, we've shifted our focus from asking, how do we minimize the harm caused by agriculture, to how do we restore and enhance the function of agricultural ecosystems? So it's not enough to necessarily focus on sustaining degraded ecosystems and making them more efficient. We really need to regenerate these farms and ranches in order to adapt and mitigate the major challenges that agriculture is facing. And that's what's led us to regenerative agriculture. So you can see this commitment that we just made last year to advance regenerative ag on 1 million acres by 2030. And we want our 1 million acres to be the catalyst that sparks the change on the next 100 million. So, as I think back to the recent commitments and shifts in perspective from other companies, I think you can see that momentum is building in the industry around these ideas. And so I'll give you a break from listening to me and play a quick video for you to hear from some farmers on this topic. They say it better than I could.
It's a whole lot easier to make a living on the farm when we're not writing checks for external inputs all the time. So if we can produce nitrogen with a cover crop here, it's one less check I got to write in June.
The word sustainable for us is it's not good enough. We have a degenerated system here. That's why regenerative makes more sense. We don't want to sustain a broken system. We want to build the system, fix the system, and that's why we call ourselves regenerative farmers.
We see birds here we've never seen before in our life. There's birders that come to watch these birds from all over the Midwest because they hear they're here on this land. We see all kinds of different insects now that we've never seen before, above ground and below ground. It's just amazing as you fix and heal the soil, what can come back.
We are breaking tradition, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Change is inevitable. Mother Nature has been pretty dang tough on us here. Having regenerative agricultural practices has given us resilience so that we can adapt to the things that she's been hitting us over the head with. This works everywhere in the world. It's the same principles that can be applied to any piece of ground anywhere in the world, and it is happening everywhere. It's just part of the love of farming that you want to be able to pass that on to other generations.
All right. Thank you, Grant and Don. Let's see, can I move forward here? Okay. Turn my video back on. So Grant and Don said it. Really, that they captured for us the need to shift from sustainability to regeneration and work to fix and repair this ecosystem, and how that has cascading positive impacts for the farm business. We see benefits in the farm community, and hopefully entire food systems. And that's really why we're trying to invest in this new paradigm. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what is regenerative ag and how we define it, and give you some kind of insight into what this is all about. First, regenerative ag is a set of principles. These can be used by any farmer or rancher anywhere to improve the function of their farm or ranch. So organic, conventional, doesn't matter. Any farmer can implement these things. And so regenerative ag is not just one thing. It's not just one practice. It's really these principles coming together in a system. And so I'll touch on each of these very briefly. But really, these principles are how we regenerate agricultural ecosystems, sequester carbon, clean up water, reduce emissions, and provide all of those other critical services that we need. And so the first principle here in the middle is to understand context. No two farms or ranches are the same, and understanding the particular constraints and opportunities of a given field is really critical to understanding how to make these other principles successful. The next is to minimize chronic disturbances to the ecosystem. So a lot of people understand the negative effects of tillage, but pesticides, fertilizers, haying, these can also be destructive, and minimizing those chronic disturbances can help the farm ecosystem begin to self-regulate. The next is maximize crop diversity. So, this helps farmers naturally defend themselves against pests and disease, improves resilience, but also can improve soil health and maximizes the provision of lots of different ecosystem services. If you think about pollination to weed suppression, all these different things that farmers need plants to do, maximizing diversity helps them achieve multiple benefits. The next is keep the soil covered. Pretty straightforward. Having that thick layer of armor, that plant residue on the soil surface, protects the soil against wind and rain, hot sun, prevents it from washing away or wasting moisture to evaporation. So keeping the soil covered is important for keeping the soil there and keeping it functioning. The next principle is keep a living root in the ground year round, or as long throughout the year as your context allows. And so this is important because soil is alive. It is a living thing. It is full of living things that are critical to the function of the agricultural ecosystem. And those organisms need food in order to survive. And that food is carbon, which is fixed by plants through photosynthesis. But in ag, we leave so many potential days of growth on the table. If you think about most crops that we grow, corn, soybeans, oats, wheat, potatoes, whatever it is, they're only growing for a certain number of months throughout the year. And so filling those gaps in the spring or in the fall, in summer fallow periods, taking advantage of every possible ray of sunlight and turning it into a green living plant. That's the way that we feed and regenerate the soil and sequester carbon. The last one is, to integrate livestock. So bringing livestock onto croplands represents a huge opportunity to build soils through hoof impact and nutrient cycling, and it can make it easier and more profitable to integrate the other principles, having that extra revenue stream. So just a little pop quiz. I know it's not super interactive, but we'll think about those principles and try to put them to the test. And so this is kind of something I see or I think about every time I go out to a farm, or I'm even driving through agricultural country, is just looking out the window. What do you see and what's missing? What principles might be out here? So this soil, I see a lot of clumpy soil. You can see here, that's a sign that it's been tilled, heavily tilled. So there's a lot of disturbance. Obviously, there's no green plant, so there's no living root in the ground. There's no diversity. All you see is bare soil, so the soil's not covered. And obviously, there's no livestock. So none of the principles are here. And the reality is, this is what a lot of agricultural land looks like for a lot of the year. And so we need to get these principles onto these farms to help regenerate the soil. Another question to think about is this field organic or conventional? There's no way to tell. So this is part of the point, is that regenerative is this kind of universal set of principles that any farmer, organic or conventional, can use to improve their soil, improve their farm ecosystem. And so it's not just one or the other. And is it regenerative? I think because none of the principles are here, this soil is likely degenerating, not regenerating. So that was just a little pop quiz, but here is a picture of what that field could look like, around this time of year. So I took this picture in November in North Dakota. This is a diverse cover crop mix. The only purpose for this plant mix is just to feed the soil, keep it covered. The farmer keeps it there to, retain the nutrients in the soil. And next year, most of these things are going to die over the winter, but, even in November in North Dakota, this mix of plants is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. It's feeding the soil. And this is what I was talking about before with keep a living root in the ground. We want to fill every single possible window, take advantage of every ray of sunlight, and turn that into a green plant. And that's how you restore soil and ecosystems. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip this example, but lots of different ways to implement the principles in lots of different systems. There's hundreds of different practices that farmers are experimenting with. But I want to get to our definition. So this is how General Mills defines regenerative ag. So it is a holistic, principles-based approach to farming and ranching that seeks to strengthen ecosystems and community resilience. So we take an outcome-based definition as opposed to like a practice-based checklist or a certification or something like that. So we consider a farm regenerative if it's improving soil health, biodiversity, water, and farmer economic resilience. And regenerative ag is a farmer-led movement. We don't want to take away from that or impose a certain set of practices or a checklist that farmers have to hit. Our goal is really to grow this movement and grow its potential to regenerate ecosystems and livelihoods. And this one commitment lets us work across multiple issue areas at once, which allows us to take a more holistic view of our impacts and really try to be a force for good everywhere we source ingredients. So now I'm going to talk about, what we're doing. How are we working to accelerate adoption of regenerative ag? So General Mills, General Mills is a food company. We don't own farms or have many direct connections with farmers. And so we need to figure out, how do we meaningfully engage the agricultural sector to advance this movement? And so that's what we're piloting, a range of strategies and partnerships in key sourcing regions to accelerate the adoption of these systems and to measure the environmental and economic outcomes. And so here's a map of where some of our pilots are today and some of the brands that source a key ingredient from those regions. And so I'll zoom into just one of our pilot strategies and talk about what that looks like and why we have that suite of investments. So these are some of the components that make up some of these regenerative ag pilots. And these all come together, together in the same pilot. So all the farmers are receiving all of these things in the Northern Plains pilot, the Kansas pilot, and also in Michigan. The first step is education. We're holding free soil health academies, which are multiple day workshops that give farmers a solid grounding in the regenerative principles. And they bring in local regenerative farmers to talk about how they're doing it and what effects they've seen. The next step is pairing farmers up one-on-one with a regenerative ag coach. We hear from farmers all the time that, they'll go to a conference or something and they'll learn about soil health. But when they go think about how to change something on their farm, they aren't sure where to start. Or they don't have enough confidence to try something new. And having someone who can help them consider the unique context and help them develop and adapt their own regenerative management plan over several years can give them enough confidence to take that next step. And we have a huge diversity of farmers in the program. So some that are pretty far down the path already, and others who haven't really yet implemented any of the principles. So we're trying to meet farmers where they're at and provide them the resources they need to take the next step on their own regenerative journey. And it's going to be different. There's organic and conventional farmers together in all these programs, and everybody's, steps and paths to these regenerative systems are very different. So that's kind of where this approach helps everybody everybody kind of work along their own unique journey to a regenerative system. Next, we're working to build community. So we're connecting regenerative farmers together, going down this path, through discussion groups and field days and social media groups, so that they can learn together about what's working and what's not. We do hear a lot from farmers, regenerative farmers in particular, that they feel like they're the only ones in their community doing it. And farming different from everyone else in your area can be isolating. And that social pressure is definitely one of the barriers that we're working to overcome. Another component of this pilot is in-depth scientific research on the changes in soil, biodiversity, water, and farm economics that occur as farmers implement these regenerative systems. And I'll go into more detail on that in the next part of this talk. And the last component of the pilot in Kansas especially is a pilot of an ecosystem service marketplace. So this program is one of the first pilots for the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, which is a consortium of 50 plus food and ag companies, nonprofits, universities, all these organizations coming together to try to stand up a voluntary marketplace where companies can pay farmers for sequestering carbon, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving water quality, reducing water usage, and even working on biodiversity credits now as well. So General Mills, we conducted some soil sampling this spring and are enrolling farmers in this ecosystem service market if they want to opt in. And so we'll be paying farmers for any greenhouse gas emission reductions they generate, and also partnering with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. They'll be buying water quality credits that farmers are generating as they transition to these regenerative systems. And we're looking to expand this pilot into Oklahoma as well. So next is I'm going to talk about how we're measuring economic and environmental impact. And you remember I talked about General Mills has an outcome-based definition of regenerative ag. So if we want to see improvements in soil health, biodiversity, water, farm economics, and climate as well. So measuring these impacts on the ground in these sourcing regions is critical. And part of my job is to figure out how do we measure across all of these outcome areas And how do we do it at scale so that we can do this at the scale of millions of acres so that we can really quantify the impact of this movement and also help us track progress towards our 1,000,000-acre goal. So I'll talk about a little bit what we're doing today and what we're investing in as a possible future for assessing these impacts. So currently, we're conducting a lot of manual work to take soil samples and run analyses in the lab. But this is really how we're working to track changes in soil health and soil carbon sequestration on farms in our regenerative ag pilots. And there aren't enough grad students in the world to implement this approach across millions of acres. So in the future, we're working, we plan to leverage high-tech tools like satellite imagery, which can detect changes in agricultural practices like cover cropping and no-till on the landscape. And we can couple that information with mathematical models that tell us how the soil and water quality responds. And we can validate all those modeling results by sampling across a much smaller area than we otherwise would need to. But we are investing in the development of different tools for measuring soil health and water quality so that we can do it much cheaper and easier in the future. Similarly, for biodiversity, we're working with many partners to manually assess birds and insects living on these farms and tracking changes over time. So, insects perform critical services like pollination and predation of pests. So we're working to measure not only how many and what types of insects are in these fields, but also what ecosystem services they're providing for farmers. Why should farmers care about insects? It's because they ultimately affect their farm business. And so we want to quantify those beneficial outcomes that insects provide. For birds, the reality is we don't know much about how regenerative management in cropping systems affects them. I think we have a lot of great information for regenerative grazing and that the impact on birds, the beneficial impacts that has. But many regenerative farmers, and like you heard from Grant and Don, have been seeing more in different kinds of birds than they have in the past. And so we're working to conduct that research to figure out, what is the link maybe between regenerative management in these croplands, maybe the insect community and how that changes, and then how birds respond to that, because birds eat insects. There also might be a greater diversity of habitats in these regenerative systems. So we're working to kind of put those pieces together. And to track changes in biodiversity at a larger scale, we're working to develop some high-tech tools like cameras coupled with artificial intelligence to detect insects, or microphones that can monitor bird calls, and couple that information with satellite imagery and modeling so we can predict what's happening at the landscape level. Next is, farmer economics. And so the reason why many farmers have already adopted regenerative ag is because it's helped them become more profitable and resilient. And so, really we need data to answer, we need more data to answer critical questions for farmers, like how quickly can I become more profitable, or how much more profitable is regenerative ag? And so we're working to answer some of these questions by tracking costs and returns on some of these study fields, and also working on, partial enterprise budgeting, trying to get a sense of what changes economically in the farm business as you implement these regenerative systems. In the future, so we're also looking to build out tools like satellite imagery, where we can potentially assess things like yield risk, which would help us better understand the link between farm management, soil health, and farm economic resilience. And I'm just going to close with this. We put a lot of effort against measuring this holistic suite of outcomes because regenerative ag creates so much benefit for so many different people. We recently worked with a group called Ecotone Analytics with help from Kansas Department of Health and Environment, No-Till on the Plains, and Cheney Lake watershed to generate a report on the social return on investment of regenerative ag. We found that investing $1 in regenerative ag generates $5 in additional social, environmental, and economic value. And that's value for the farmers, for the climate, for water users, the local community, taxpayers, all these different stakeholders. And so this is the impact that we can potentially have if we focus on regenerating farm ecosystems. And at General Mills, we really believe this is the opportunity to regenerate not only farm ecosystems, but farm businesses, hopefully farm communities, and ultimately entire food systems. So with that, I will take some questions if there are any questions. Not sure I see some coming through on my side. Oops.
Stephen, we've got one in the queue for you. And I'll read it off for you and then you can answer as you see fit. Isn't regenerative ag the same as what indigenous peoples did for thousands of years? If so, how is General Mills recognizing the traditional land management knowledge that these cultures are contributing to these efforts?
Yeah, I've been reading up and listening to podcasts, listening to indigenous farmers and their perspectives on regenerative ag. I mean, in some ways, even the term agriculture, I've heard indigenous communities don't necessarily like, but definitely the regenerative ag movement kind of currently as in its modern incarnation is building on ideas that were developed by indigenous peoples over thousands of years. And, especially ideas of energy flow and these cycles and the relationship that we have with nature. Regenerative ag is about farming, with Mother Nature instead of against her. And so I think a lot of these ideas definitely stem from indigenous knowledge and the way indigenous people still are farming today. So that's important to recognize. And I think, in part, one of the things that we've been doing, especially at ESMC, the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, I mentioned is for all of these investments that we're making, especially in like building something like an ecosystem service market that can serve as a tool of economic empowerment for farmers, is to make sure tools like that work for all farmers. So I'm part of a racial equity and justice and inclusion group that is focusing on how do we set up a market like that actually benefits Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and not only a certain subset of the farmers. How can we make sure that this can be a tool of economic empowerment for everyone? And so that's where really we're sourcing insights from lots of different types of farmers and figuring out what types of barriers might exist for their entry and how do we design the market in a way that can be accessed by lots of people, because indigenous communities especially are greatly benefiting from a lot of carbon markets today. And so I think we need to build on some of those successes, make sure that what we're building for the future can be important for that. I'm seeing lots more questions coming in now.
Yep, and I'm going to queue this one up for you. What would you say is the top issue slowing adoption of cover crops and row crop ag?
That's a good question. So, right now, I think we're just about under 5% of the available cropland that has actually adopted cover crops. And so there's some big barriers to that. The top issue slowing adoption, it's obviously a whole bunch of issues coming together, but one is that farmers in a lot of ways are trying to make it to the next year, and there's real economic costs to cover crops. It can cost $20 an acre to put a cover crop in the ground, and soil and these ecosystems take time to respond and regenerate and produce those economic benefits over time. And so how do we support farmers in implementing these systems that have these longer term payouts while also realizing that they have this economic cost up front? And so that kind of economic barrier, I'd say, is a big one. So the costs are very tangible and near term, but the benefits are less tangible and farther out. And so one of the pilot models that we have is investing in Costshare. How do we basically help cover those costs for farmers of planting those cover crops to get them started, so that they can, for 3 years, for even longer in some cases, so that they can start to generate and realize those benefits that those cover crops have, so they can start to pay for themselves and have a more kind of sustained system over time, help them get over that initial hurdle. So I guess that's a big one that stands out to me.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Stephen. And we have a flurry of questions, so everyone, we'll try to get to as many as we can. Is General Mills unique in its approach? Are other large public companies participating in this movement as well? Are you familiar with any ETFs focused on this for investors?
Yeah, so we partner with a bunch of other companies up and down the value chain. So, other food companies, but also lots of suppliers of ours, retailers of ours are investing in this space. And that's one of the things that's really great that I see is as the industry moves in this direction, that's kind of what we're trying to help lead. But, as a lot of companies come into this space, we're all piloting lots of different strategies. And so we're building spaces now where we can learn together about what investments and strategies are the most meaningful and scalable and effective ways of driving adoption, accelerating adoption of this movement and growing it. And so that's been heartening to see as more and more companies come into this space. We just get a lot better at supporting farmers in this way, in ways that are meaningful. So yes, the answer is yes. As far as any ETFs focused on this for investors, I don't know about that. I mean, I know there's growing, there's funds like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index that capture kind of companies that focus on sustainability more broadly. But as far as work specifically in regenerative ag, I'm not sure about that.
All right, next up, in Regen Ag, do you see organic, GMO, and other types of crops coexisting?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned before, I mean, it's agnostic to the specific inputs that you use, but what we know about regenerating these ecosystems is captured in those principles. And so organic farmers, non-GMO farmers, and conventional farmers, they all have these pathways to a regenerative system that revolve around the principles. And depending on which kind of market you're in, there's different paths to get there. And that's where I think we have to be inclusive in how we work across regenerative ag so that we can give all types of farmers a pathway to improve their ecosystem. That's ultimately what we need. We have to work at a large scale if we're going to address these large challenges. And so we need all farmers working together. Well, not together necessarily, but every farmer having an opportunity to have a path towards these regenerative systems. And that's really the promise of regenerative ag.
Thank you for that. Next question up. You mentioned Costshare for cover crops. What is General Mills specifically doing right now already to help farmers cover the cost for adopting Regen?
So one good example is just kicking off a partnership now with the Wilkin County Conservation District. Actually, this is a pilot through MBOLD. So we're partnering with Cargill on this project in the Red River Valley of Minnesota and North Dakota. We're investing $1 million over 5 years that are going to farmers in 3-county region that is going through the conservation district, where farmers are basically receiving, we're not dictating what practices they need to use. They can kind of pick from a whole different set of practices, but whichever ones they pick, they get a certain payment for those practices, basically covering the costs of doing those things. And it's very similar to the current Farm Bill conservation programs that are out there, like EQIP. It's really kind of investing money into those programs to make them more accessible, because right now there's way more demand for those cost share dollars than is currently available through existing Farm Bill programs. And so that's really where we have the opportunity for these public-private partnerships to come together to expand access for those cost share funds. One thing about cost share is we think it's really important not only to provide that economic incentive and help farmers manage that risk early on, but also to have technical assistance that's paired with it, because it's really knowledge intensive and challenging to successfully implement some of these practices. And so anytime we have cost share or this economic piece, we're also trying to provide a coach, someone that has experience and is a trusted partner for that farmer and can really help them think through how to make that practice most successful, and also to drive the understanding of why am I adopting this practice? Not just because I'm getting a payment for it, but because regeneration of my ecosystem is essential. And so having that understanding of why is going to be the only way that a farmer sticks with the practice longer term after an incentive or some sort of cost share payment goes away. Understanding how their management is connected to soil health and functioning of the ecosystem, and how that piece is essential for the long-term resilience of their business. Building that understanding is, I think, the most important thing we can do. And cost share is kind of a way to help farmers overcome these early economic hurdles. But there's also these huge barriers in mindset and education that also have to be overcome. And so it can't just be about one thing. It can't just be about cost share. It has to be a suite of things. And that's kind of where you saw in our pilot models, we have not only economic support, but also coaching, technical resources, social support, having a network of other farmers to work on this stuff with. You know, all these things kind of coming together is, I think, what it's going to take. Yeah, that was a long answer to that question.
No, very, very well rounded. And I think it's great you're addressing, this is a great lead into the next question here. And I love that you're talking about the entire package that is needed to kind of drive this change. And this question is really more about, you know, in order to incent these best practices, ultimately they are economic incentives required. And will General Mills be paying a premium for the grower that maintains these processes? And can you pass that on to the consumer? And personally, I would add, you know, where do we see the government playing a role in this? Is there current subsidies for certain crops and things like that? So feel free to tackle that in whatever way you feel.
Yeah, so the number one question I get from farmers is, are you going to pay me more to do these things? And you know, and the question is, are you going to pay me more for my oats or for my wheat? A premium attached to the product for doing these things. And in some cases, the answer is yes. You know, our organic business certainly pays a premium to organic farmers for doing these things. And now, you know, even piloting opportunities for segregating supply chains, identity preserving ingredients grown on regenerative farms. A lot of that stuff is being piloted within General Mills. But I'd say for the most part, there's a lot of challenges associated with that. One is, you know, a lot of consumers, mainstream consumers, don't necessarily understand what regenerative ag is. And so we're on this journey with consumers as well to figure out how do we best, you know, integrate them into this movement, help them understand what the work is that's happening on the ground so that they would want to pay more for it. I think that link is not there yet today. And so we have to build that link. The other is the way supply chains are set up. In a lot of cases, it's really hard to trace an ingredient down to a particular field where this ingredient was grown. And, you know, I think that's where we have a real opportunity to deliver not a premium for the ingredient, but a payment for the ecosystem services, because it's not necessarily regeneratively grown wheat that we necessarily need. It's really these positive environmental and economic outcomes. And so we have this pathway to get there potentially through an ecosystem service market where, you know, it's not the grain that's generating these beneficial outcomes, it's the land. And so we're crediting, you know, we're paying for these benefits on the land. And so I think that's maybe a more near-term opportunity while we work through some of these other issues related to consumer knowledge or awareness or interest in regenerative ag, is actually getting those funds to purchasing these positive environmental benefits. I forgot the second part of the question, but maybe that addressed it.
I think you covered most of it. So
Okay.
we'll pivot a little bit. What is the role of regenerative ag in food security? I know, you know, General Mills obviously a part of MBOLD and wanting to fulfill the goal of how do we feed 10 billion people by 2050. So I'd love to hear your comments on food insecurity.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the climate is changing. And that farmers and ranchers are on the front lines of climate change. They are currently the first sector, the biggest sector facing these real changes in weather. It's more extreme weather, bigger swings from year to year, more extremes, more unpredictable. And that has real implications for food security. So the price, the quality, the availability of food is directly impacted by farmers and ranchers' ability to withstand these changes in climate. And regenerative ag, you know, really we need to leverage the natural resilience of healthy ecosystems if we're going to weather those extremes. And so that's where building the resilience of these ecosystems, restoring their function and health, that's really the way that we can build resilience against these changes that we're facing. And so, you know, I guess that's what I would say is, you know, regenerative ag isn't necessarily about producing the most amount of food humanly possible. It's about restoring these ecosystems while producing food. And that's really the challenge that we need to accomplish if we're going to be able to produce food for another, you know, 50, 100, 150 years. General Mills has been around for 150 years. We want to be around for another 150 producing food. That's not going to happen unless we have resilient food systems and healthy agricultural ecosystems.
Absolutely. And this question kind of ties in a few of your previous statements, but I want you to add anything if you think you can at this point, which is how do you change the mindset of growing what will make money to what will help the ecosystem and make less money or potentially none?
So I don't ever think we're going to convince anyone to make no money. I think we have to, these sustainability can't be a trade-off if it's going to work. It has to be a win-win for farmers and the environment. And that's really what we see with regenerative ag. You don't have to sacrifice economically in order to make a profit. I mean, we see this movement of farmers growing. This is not something that came from General Mills or from the food industry. This has been a movement of farmers doing this stuff on their own with no external incentive because they see this as being better for their business. And that is what we are trying to promote and spread. And so, I guess that's what I'd say is inherently, this isn't a trade-off. This doesn't have to be a trade-off between making money and doing good things for the environment. It's really a win-win, and that's what the opportunity is. And really, I think the barrier is in that understanding, creating the link in farmers and ranchers' minds, helping them see the way that the ecosystem functions and the health of the ecosystem is related to their farm business. I think that is a critical piece of work for the whole industry to work towards.
Well, Stephen, we are at time, but there's still a slew of questions. So I'm sure if you hosted a podcast, you'd get tons of people to participate. And I think General Mills is doing some really fantastic work here. So thank you again for sharing about all of this work in the space. And if there's a way to reach out at General Mills and they can share more, I'm sure they'd be happy to do it. We will have a quick break before we come back with our panel of ag tech companies led by investor Mary Grove of Bread and Butter Ventures. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you back here soon.